The gates of Dachau groaned as they swung open. Not by the whip of an SS officer, but by the thunder of American tanks. The towers that once loomed with rifles now stood powerless, their silhouettes mocking the authority that had ruled with iron and blood. Here's a first-hand account from Sergeant Gene Miller of the day. Dachau was liberated.
And about 30 miles from Munich is the worst thing was Dachau. It's hard to believe what they'll do to a human. I remember walking through the barracks. People are kneeling, kissing your hand. And you say, why should that be?
The guards who remained shuffled nervously, their black uniforms suddenly nothing more than costumes. The Reich they had served was collapsing like rotten timber. The 1,000-year empire had lasted barely 12, and the power these guards once wielded, the power of life and death, slipped from their hands in an instant. Many dropped their weapons. Some raised their hands. A few begged. They thought surrender would save them. They thought their captives would show restraint, that Allied soldiers would act as their shield. But surrender was not always accepted. The prisoners had waited too long. Their bodies were broken, their dignity stripped, but their memories were sharp. They remembered the faces of the tormentors who had beaten them, starved them, and mocked them while their friends collapsed at their feet. And now, the balance had shifted. In the days and hours after liberation, these living skeletons did not always seek peace. Some sought vengeance. They became executioners, and the SS became prey. What followed was not orderly, nor was it merciful. It was grotesque, chaotic, and fueled by years of rage compressed into a single moment. This is the story of what happened in those final hours, when the gates opened and the prisoners' revenge began. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was in its death rattle. Adolf Hitler still barked delusions from his Berlin bunker, but his empire was crumbling at every border. The Red Army stormed from the east, swallowing whole cities in fire and blood, while American and British forces pressed from the west, cracking through the once proud defenses of the Wehrmacht. The Nazi war machine had been broken, but its cruelty had not stopped. Inside the concentration camps, the SS continued their reign of terror until the very last possible moment. Prisoners were still executed in courtyards, still whipped and beaten for collapsing at work, still herded into death marches, long columns driven across Germany, where thousands dropped dead on the roadside. The guards knew their world was ending, yet they clung to their routines. They shouted orders, carried out roll calls, and tried desperately to maintain the illusion that their power was eternal. But the prisoners could feel the change in the air. The thunder of artillery grew closer each day. Smoke rose on the horizon, and whispers spread from barracks to barracks. The Allies are coming. But liberation was not expected to be merciful. Rumors flowed of what the Soviets were doing as they captured camps in the east. Guards executed in ditches, civilians punished for collaboration. Survivors at Buchenwald and Dachau knew the Americans would be different, but the thirst for retribution burned within them nonetheless. The prisoners were not faceless victims. They were men and women who remembered every beating, every humiliation. Some had watched their families dragged to the gas chambers. Others bore scars from whips, rifle butts, and snarling dogs. And as the Reich collapsed, these memories transformed into something darker, an unspoken pact that justice, real justice, would not wait for courts or tribunals. For years, the SS had wielded their uniforms like armor. Now, stripped of their power, they were nothing more than frightened men surrounded by enemies who knew their names, their faces, their crimes. The Reich was falling, but for the prisoners inside the camps, the real reckoning was just beginning. Behind the barbed wire, memory was the prisoners' only weapon. They remembered the laughter of guards who beat them with rifle butts until ribs cracked. They remembered the dogs, unleashed for sport. They remembered the selections, where a finger pointed left or right meant the difference between slow starvation and the choking gas chambers. Inmates whispered the names of their tormentors, storing them like coals in their hearts. A capo who betrayed fellow prisoners for scraps of food, an SS overseer who delighted in kicking men to death, a block leader who stole blankets from the sick and dying. These names became curses muttered at night, promises that if the world ever turned upside down, justice would come. At Buchenwald, there was more than whispers. A secret resistance had taken root. Prisoners smuggled weapons, built hidden radios, and drew up lists of guards and collaborators. They waited for the day when the sirens would no longer summon them to roll call, but to retribution. In Dachau, survivors later told of the eerie silence on the morning of April 29, 1945. Word had spread that the Americans were close. Some prisoners could barely stand, yet they dragged themselves to the camp gates to watch. They did not cheer. They did not cry. Their hollow eyes followed the guards, who now shifted nervously, their hands twitching over rifles they would never fire again. At Mauthausen, men who had been reduced to skeletons remembered with burning clarity the faces of the sadists who had overseen the stairs of death. 186 stone steps where prisoners were forced to carry granite blocks until they collapsed, only to be kicked down like broken dolls. Survivors later admitted that liberation did not erase these memories. It sharpened them. One former prisoner recalled,
"We were ghosts. They had starved us, beaten us, and thought we would die without a fight. But when freedom came, we knew their time had run out. The ghosts came for them."
The camps were filled with men and women on the very brink of death, yet inside, their spirits burned with a rage so deep it could outlast starvation. And when the gates opened, that rage would be unleashed. For years, the SS had wrapped themselves in a cloak of invincibility. The rifle, the watchtower, the snarling dogs, these were their shields. They strutted through the camps as gods, deciding who lived, who starved, and who was sent to die in the chambers of smoke. But liberation tore away that illusion. At Dachau, the gates opened to the roar of American tanks. SS guards, their swagger gone, tossed rifles into the dirt. Some tore off their insignia, hoping to vanish into the sea of prisoners. Others raised their hands, trembling, trying to pass as harmless soldiers caught in the wrong place. But the prisoners knew their faces. They remembered every order, every smirk, every cruel laugh. The striped skeletons who had once cowered now surged forward. Eyewitnesses told of guards being seized in the open, their black uniforms yanked from their bodies as they were clubbed and kicked. In the chaos, one man was beaten with the butt of his own rifle until the wood splintered. At Buchenwald, the underground resistance moved swiftly. The day before the Americans arrived, they had already stormed the guard towers. Prisoners dragged SS men from hiding places, spitting in their faces as they were hurled into the dirt. Some were lynched from lampposts, their corpses swaying above the cheering crowd. At Mauthausen, vengeance took on an even darker shape. Survivors recalled the first moments after liberation, when the most hated overseers were dragged into barracks and beaten in silence. One capo, infamous for killing men with a shovel, was himself beaten with the same tool until his body crumpled in the dust. The SS no longer commanded terror. They were stripped of it, piece by piece, until they were nothing but frightened men surrounded by enemies who had nothing left to lose. And when the guards screamed, no one came to save them. Liberation was supposed to be a sunrise. For the soldiers who opened the gates, it was a moment of triumph. But for the prisoners, the dawn broke in blood and vengeance. In Dachau, the campyard turned into a frenzy. U.S. troops had lined the captured SS men along a wall, but prisoners surged past the Americans, clawing and striking at their tormentors. Some guards were clubbed until their skulls cracked. Others were shoved to the ground and stomped until their bodies stopped moving. One survivor later whispered that the air reeked of justice, raw and terrible. The Americans tried to pull prisoners back, but the dam had broken. In one corner of the camp, a group of inmates dragged an SS overseer into the latrine. For years, he had forced men to clean it with their bare hands. Now, he was shoved into the pit and drowned in the very filth he once lorded over. At Buchenwald, the vengeance was more organized and more haunting. The underground resistance stormed the camp's guard posts, dragging officers into the open. Some were hung from lampposts, their bodies twisting in the wind as prisoners shouted curses in half a dozen languages. Others were locked in rooms with men who had endured their blows for years. When the doors opened again, the guards were no longer recognizable. At Mauthausen, the horror took on an eerie silence. Survivors later spoke of guards being cornered in barracks, their pleas muffled by fists and boots. One capo, infamous for striking prisoners with iron bars, was beaten with the same weapon until it bent. "We closed the doors," a prisoner said years later. What happened inside? We never spoke of it again. What made these moments so grotesque was not only the violence itself, but the intimacy. These were not anonymous executions. They were personal reckonings carried out by men who remembered every face, every scar. It was not about justice as the world defines it. It was revenge, primal and unrestrained, the scream of the powerless who had been silenced too long. The camp that had once echoed with Nazi commands now resounded with something else. Screams, curses, and the long-suppressed fury of the broken reclaiming their humanity in the most brutal way possible. And when night fell, the camps did not fall quiet. Behind closed doors, behind barred rooms, the prisoners' reckoning went on. The SS, once masters of terror, were reduced to prey hunted in the darkness. When the fury subsided, the camp stood in a strange silence. The barbed wire still glistened with dew, the towers still loomed, but the order that had defined them was gone. The SS were broken, their corpses sprawled in the dust or hanging from lampposts. Some lay unburied for days, their black uniforms stripped, their faces swollen from the blows that had ended them. The American and Soviet liberators tried to restore control, horrified by what they witnessed. At Dachau, US officers ordered prisoners back into their barracks, barking at them not unlike the guards had done hours before. Some American soldiers themselves executed SS men in rage after seeing the piles of emaciated corpses in the crematoria. Others looked away when prisoners carried out their vengeance, as if silently agreeing that no court could deliver a punishment fitting for such crimes. But in the years that followed, survivors spoke with unease about those hours. Some admitted to feeling shame. They had been reduced to the same brutality they despised, and liberation did not erase the weight of that blood. Others, however, spoke with grim certainty that what happened in those final hours was not cruelty, but justice. Real justice, delivered by the hands of the condemned upon their tormentors. The grotesque irony was unmistakable. For years, the SS had built an empire of humiliation, torment, and death. They had stripped human beings of dignity and reduced them to numbers. Yet in the end, it was the SS who were reduced, not to gods, not even to men, but to prey. And though historians debate the details, the legacy of those nights remains haunting. It was a reminder that liberation is not always clean, that freedom does not arrive with calm parades and speeches. Sometimes it arrives screaming, with fists and blood, with vengeance carried out in the shadows. The camps were places of unspeakable cruelty. But in those last moments, they became something else. Arenas where the powerless seized power, and where the masters of death finally learned what it was to be hunted. The ghosts of those nights still linger. Survivors carried them to their graves, and history records them not as justice, nor as crime, but as the terrible truth of what happens when human cruelty festers too long. The liberation of the camps is often remembered in photographs, Smiling soldiers beside emaciated survivors, flags waving over barbed wire. But the truth was darker, messier, and far more disturbing. Freedom did not arrive gently. It arrived like a storm, ripping apart everything in its path, leaving vengeance in its wake. The SS had built a world of cruelty, convinced they would forever hold the power of life and death. Yet when the gates opened, they discovered the truth. Power is fragile, and terror cannot protect those who wield it forever. The prisoners who struck back were not heroes in that moment, nor villains. They were human beings, scarred beyond recognition, carrying the unbearable weight of memory. Their hands delivered blows, not just for themselves, but for the millions who never saw liberation. And so, the camps became places of reckoning, not just for the guards, but for humanity itself. They showed us what happens when cruelty rules unchecked, and what happens when the oppressed finally break their chains. History does not tidy these moments. It leaves them raw, unsettling, grotesque. The SS were torn apart, but so too was the illusion that liberation is ever clean. When the gates opened, freedom came with blood. And in those haunting hours, the hunters became the hunted, and the ghosts of the camps finally had their revenge. If you found this story haunting, remember to like this video and subscribe to Twisted Facts Vault. More dark truths of World War II await. Stories that history remembers, but rarely dares to speak aloud.